The once renowned asylum stood at the heart of an endless sea of cornfields, its crumbling facade a testament to decades of neglect. The sun, dimmed by a perpetual haze, barely pierced through the thick, looming stalks, casting twisted shadows across the broken path leading to its rusted gates. Edgar Wolfe, a private investigator with a reputation for uncovering the darkest secrets, had been drawn to this forsaken place by rumors of inexplicable disappearances and unnatural occurrences. As he approached the imposing structure, a sense of dread settled in his bones, as if the very air around the asylum was charged with malevolent intent. The walls of the asylum seemed to whisper, beckoning him closer with promises of uncovering horrors that should have remained buried. Lillian Blackwood, a historian with an insatiable curiosity for the macabre, had joined Edgar in his investigation, drawn by the asylum's dark and storied past. The records she had uncovered hinted at unethical experiments and inhumane treatments that had taken place within its walls. Yet the official reports were vague, as if someone had deliberately erased the truth. Together with Fiona Darke, a journalist known for her fearless pursuit of the truth, they had entered the asylum's grounds, each step bringing them deeper into a world where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. The cornfields surrounding the asylum swayed ominously, as if alive with a dark purpose, and the trio felt as though they were being watched by unseen eyes. The interior of the asylum was even more oppressive than the outside. The walls were lined with decaying wallpaper, peeling away to reveal the mold-covered bricks beneath. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and the faint echoes of long-forgotten screams seemed to resonate through the darkened halls. As they ventured further inside, the trio couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum was more than just an abandoned building. It was a living entity, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who dared to enter. The deeper they went, the more the darkness seemed to close in around them, as if the asylum itself was trying to consume them whole. In the center of the asylum, they discovered the old patient records room, its shelves filled with dust-covered files that chronicled the lives and untimely deaths of those who had once called this place home. As Lillian began to sift through the files, her eyes widened in horror. The names of the patients were familiar, not because of their notoriety, but because they matched the names of people who had vanished from nearby towns in recent years. But these patients couldn't possibly be the same people. Many of the files were over a century old. Yet the pictures attached to the records showed faces that were eerily similar to those of the missing, frozen in time, their eyes filled with a silent plea for help. As Edgar, Lillian, and Fiona pieced together the fragmented information, a chilling realization began to take hold. The patients of the asylum were not human, or at least they weren't anymore. The experiments that had taken place within these walls had twisted them into something else, something that defied nature. These abominations were still here, lurking in the shadows, hidden within the asylum's labyrinthine corridors. And now, the investigators were trapped in the very place where these inhuman creatures had been born, with no clear way out. The silence was suddenly shattered by a distant, inhuman scream that echoed through the asylum, sending chills down their spines. Whatever had been done to these patients, it was something far worse than they could have imagined. As the trio delved deeper into the asylum, the macabre nature of their surroundings became increasingly apparent. The walls were smeared with dark stains, and the floor creaked ominously underfoot. Edgar couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just out of sight in the shadows. Lillian's breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the faded documents in her hands, revealing more about the twisted experiments that had taken place here. These were not simply treatments gone wrong. They were deliberate attempts to change the very nature of the human form. The realization hit them all at once. The patients had been turned into something else, something monstrous. The further they went, the more they encountered disturbing remnants of the asylum's past. Broken medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, some of it still stained with the dried blood of those who had been subjected to the cruel experiments. Fiona shone her flashlight on a wall covered in deep erratic scratches, as if someone, or something, had tried desperately to escape. The air was thick with a rancid smell, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on them from all sides. Edgar noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that resembled a perverse mockery of human anatomy. The trio stumbled upon a sealed door at the end of a narrow corridor, its surface marked with deep gashes and strange, almost alien symbols. Edgar felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he reached for the door, his hand trembling slightly. The door creaked open to reveal a chamber filled with rows of metal beds, each one occupied by a figure covered in a tattered sheet. The room was deathly silent, the only sound being the faint buzz of flickering fluorescent lights overhead. As they cautiously approached, Edgar pulled back one of the sheets, revealing a figure that was almost human but grotesquely deformed. The sight was too much for Lillian, who turned away, her stomach churning with nausea. Fiona, however, was driven by a morbid curiosity. She began to examine the figures more closely, noting the unnatural distortions of their bodies, elongated limbs, twisted spines, faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable agony. These were the results of the asylum's experiments, beings that could no longer be considered human. Edgar felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he realized that these creatures were still alive, albeit barely. Their shallow breaths were labored, and their eyes, though dull and lifeless, seemed to track the movements of the intruders. The horror of what had been done to them began to sink in, and Edgar knew that whatever humanity they once had was long gone. Just as the group began to retreat, a low guttural sound echoed through the chamber. One of the figures on the beds began to move, its deformed limbs twitching unnaturally. The others soon followed, their movements jerky and disjointed, as if their bodies were no longer fully under their control. Panic set in as Edgar, Lillian, and Fiona backed away, realizing that they were no longer alone in this forsaken place. The abominations were awakening, their twisted forms rising from the beds with a hunger that had been suppressed for far too long. The trio turned and ran, the sound of inhuman groans and the shuffle of malformed limbs pursuing them through the darkened corridors. The trio's frantic footsteps echoed through the asylum's twisted corridors as the abominations pursued them with relentless determination. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them, as if the very walls of the asylum were conspiring to trap them within. Edgar led the way, his heart pounding in his chest as he desperately searched for an escape. Lillian and Fiona followed close behind, their fear palpable as the grotesque figures closed in, their distorted limbs dragging along the floor in a sickening display of inhumanity. Bursting through a heavy iron door, the trio found themselves in what appeared to be the asylum's operating theatre, a place where the most horrifying experiments had likely taken place. The room was bathed in a sickly green light, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood a massive, rusted operating table, surrounded by broken surgical instruments that still bore the stains of past atrocities. The walls were adorned with shelves filled with jars containing preserved organs and other unspeakable horrors, trophies of the asylum's dark history. Edgar's stomach churned as he realized they had stumbled upon the heart of the asylum's evil. As they approached the operating table, a deep guttural voice echoed through the room, chilling them to the core. From the shadows emerged a figure, its form obscured by the dim light. As it stepped forward, the trio could see that it was not entirely human. Its skin was pallid and stretched tight over an emaciated frame, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent, unnatural light. This was the head doctor of the asylum, the mastermind behind the grotesque experiments. His voice, though distorted, was filled with a twisted glee as he welcomed them to his sanctuary, his voice dripping with malevolence. The doctor revealed the true extent of his madness, explaining that the experiments were meant to create a new race of beings, superior to humans, with enhanced abilities and an unyielding will. But the experiments had gone horribly wrong, turning the patients into the abominations that now roamed the asylum. The doctor, who had somehow managed to avoid the same fate, had continued his work in secret, determined to perfect his creations. He had lured the trio to the asylum, knowing they would be perfect subjects for his next round of experiments. The revelation sent a wave of terror through Edgar, Lillian, and Fiona as they realized they were not just trapped, they were intended victims. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Edgar lunged at the doctor, determined to end his reign of terror. But the doctor was quicker than he appeared, sidestepping Edgar's attack with unnatural agility. The room erupted into chaos as the abominations, now fully awakened and driven by their master's will, poured into the operating theatre. Edgar, Lillian, and Fiona fought desperately to fend them off, using whatever they could find as weapons. The doctor's laughter echoed through the room, his voice growing louder as he reveled in the chaos. The trio knew they were outnumbered and outmatched, but they fought on, driven by sheer willpower and the desperate hope of survival. The battle in the operating theatre had left the trio battered and bruised, but they had managed to fend off the worst of the abominations. The head doctor, however, had vanished into the shadows, leaving them with the chilling realization that he was still at large. The walls of the asylum seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the building itself was reacting to the violence that had just occurred. Edgar, Lillian, and Fiona knew they had little time before the doctor would strike again, and they were determined to put an end to his twisted experiments, once and for all. As they navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the asylum, they began to notice changes in their surroundings. The walls, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, and the faint echoes of distant screams reverberated through the halls. Edgar could feel the asylum's grip tightening around them, the building itself seeming to conspire with the doctor to trap them within its twisted bowels. The trio pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that they were humanity's last hope to stop the horrors of the asylum from spreading beyond its walls. They eventually found themselves in a large chamber that appeared to be the heart of the asylum's operations. The room was dominated by a massive, grotesque machine that pulsed with an eerie, greenish light. Tubes and wires snaked out from the machine, connecting to various parts of the asylum and feeding it with the life force of the abominations. The sight filled them with dread, but it also gave them a sense of hope. They had found the source of the asylum's power, and destroying it might be their only chance to end the nightmare. As they approached the machine, the head doctor emerged once more, his form even more twisted and monstrous than before. His eyes burned with a fanatical light as he ranted about his plans to perfect his creations and spread his gift to the rest of the world. Edgar knew that there would be no reasoning with the doctor. He was too far gone, consumed by his own madness. With a silent nod, the trio prepared for one final confrontation, knowing that their lives, and the fate of countless others, hung in the balance. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with the doctor using every trick at his disposal to try and stop them. But Edgar, Lillian, and Fiona fought with a desperate determination, their every move fueled by the knowledge that failure was not an option. As the doctor attempted to activate the machine, Edgar charged at him, managing to land a critical blow that sent the doctor crashing into the device. The machine sparked and hissed, and the greenish light began to flicker and fade. With a final agonized scream, the doctor was consumed by the very power he had sought to control. The machine exploded in a shower of sparks, and the asylum began to tremble as if it were collapsing in on itself. The trio scrambled to escape, knowing that their time was running out. As the asylum began to collapse around them, Edgar, Lillian, and Fiona raced through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling debris and avoiding the grasp of the remaining abominations. The once impenetrable walls of the asylum were now cracking and breaking apart, revealing the twisted roots of the cornfields outside. The very fabric of the building seemed to be unraveling, as if the destruction of the machine had severed the lifeline that sustained it. The trio's breath came in ragged gasps as they pushed forward, desperate to escape the nightmare before it consumed them entirely. Just as they reached the entrance, a deafening roar echoed through the asylum. The head doctor, now fully transformed into a monstrous entity, appeared before them, his body grotesquely mutated and brimming with unnatural power. His eyes burned with a crazed fury as he lunged at them, determined to drag them back into the abyss with him. Edgar, summoning the last of his strength, confronted the creature, knowing that this was their final chance to escape. With a fierce resolve, he fought back against the abomination, his every move fueled by the knowledge that the lives of his companions depended on him. The battle was brutal, but Edgar's determination was unwavering. With a final, desperate blow, he struck the creature down, sending it crashing into the crumbling remnants of the asylum. The doctor's monstrous form writhed in agony, before finally disintegrating into a cloud of dust and ash. The ground beneath them shook violently, signaling that the asylum's end was imminent. Edgar turned to Lillian and Fiona, urging them to run as the building began to collapse in earnest. The trio burst through the asylum's entrance just as the structure behind them imploded, collapsing in on itself with a deafening roar. The cornfields, once sinister and alive, now stood still, their malevolent presence seemingly dissipated with the destruction of the asylum. The air was filled with dust and debris, but the trio could see the faint light of dawn breaking through the horizon. They had survived the nightmare, but the scars it left behind would haunt them forever. As they stood in the cold morning air, the reality of what they had endured began to sink in. The asylum was gone, but its horrors would linger in their minds, a dark reminder of the evil that had once thrived there. As they walked away from the ruins of the asylum, Lillian suddenly stopped and turned back, her eyes widening in shock. The cornfields, though no longer moving, were not empty. Hidden among the rows were dozens of figures, their twisted, inhuman forms barely visible in the dim light. These were the remnants of the asylum's patients, still alive, still trapped in their monstrous bodies. The realization hit them like a cold wave. Despite the destruction of the asylum, the true horror had not ended. The patients, those who had been turned into abominations, were still out there hiding among the cornfields, waiting for the chance to be free. The nightmare was far from over.